The moment I found the clause, I stopped breathing. It was buried on page 47 of a trade agreement that nobody was supposed to read in full. The Galactic Trade Council had titled it the Mutual Prosperity Accord, and that name alone should have made me suspicious. Nothing that calls itself a prosperity accord ever benefits the people who signed it under pressure. I had been sitting in the council's administrative wing for 6 hours, going through the treaty line by line, because that was my job. I was Marin Voss, diplomatic attaché to the human delegation, and nobody else in our office wanted to read 47 pages of interstellar trade language on a Tuesday. They called it a resource contribution schedule. That was the phrase. Not a tax, not a fine, a contribution schedule. The language was careful and soft, the way a trap is soft when it is covered with leaves. Any species with a Class 4 economic designation, which humanity had been quietly moved into 3 treaty cycles ago, without a single vote or announcement, was required to redirect a portion of its raw resource output to the Council's Development Reserve Fund. The portion was listed as variable, determined by the Council's Quarterly Assessment Committee. Variable, determined by the Council. Then I read it a third time. There was no ceiling on the variable percentage. There was no independent oversight of the assessment committee. There was no clause allowing the contributing species to challenge the calculation. There was a clause, in very small print near the bottom, that said all contributions were considered voluntary under interstellar law, which meant the member species had technically agreed to them by signing the accord. I pulled up the original signing record on my terminal. Ambassador Dale Pruitt had signed it. A good man. An honest man. A man who had been handed a 300-page document and told it was a standard renewal of existing trade terms. He had signed it in good faith, the way you sign a lease when you trust the landlord. I sat very still for a moment. Then I opened a new document and began writing. I did not call anyone. I did not send a message. I did not flag the clause or raise an alarm. I had learned, in 12 years of diplomatic work, that the first thing you do when you find something wrong is understand exactly how wrong it is before you open your mouth. People who shout before they measure always get told they misread the numbers. I was not going to misread the numbers. The council chamber was quiet at that hour. Most of the alien delegates had returned to their quarters for their rest cycles, and the human section of the administrative wing was nearly empty. A junior aide named Connor Webb was asleep in the lounge 2 rooms down. I could hear him snoring faintly. I did not wake him. I started with the most recent quarterly report from the Development Reserve Fund. The fund published its intake numbers, but it did not publish them in a way that made it easy to see where the contributions came from. The figures were aggregated, combined, layered under category headings that sounded technical and neutral. It took me 40 minutes to disaggregate them down to species-level contributions. When I found humanity's line, the number was so large that I thought I had made an arithmetic error. I pulled the raw data and ran it through the conversion calculator twice more to make sure I was reading the interstellar unit values correctly against standard Earth currency equivalents. I had not made an error. The quarterly contribution from human-controlled resource sectors was equivalent to the entire annual infrastructure budget of 3 mid-sized Earth colonies. Every quarter, for the past 4 years, I leaned back in my chair. The ceiling of the administrative wing was made of some pale alien material that faintly reflected light, and I stared at it for a long time. Somewhere outside the narrow window near my desk, the station's outer ring was cycling through its night phase, dimming the corridor lights to a low blue that made everything look cold and underwater. I thought about the 3 colonies whose names I had just looked up. Kepler Station 7, the Vance settlement on the 4th moon of the Areli system. New Cartwright, out on the frontier edge where the shipping lanes were thin, and the weather was bad and people had gone to build something from nothing, because Earth was crowded and the human species was restless. I thought about what their infrastructure budgets looked like. I had seen reports. I knew about the water recyclers that were running on parts twice their replacement age, the medical facilities that were short-staffed because the salary allocations kept getting trimmed, the school buildings that had been waiting on approved construction funding for years. Careful language of a variable contribution schedule. My hands were completely steady when I reached for my pen and started writing my notes on paper. Old habit from my early career, when a senior diplomat had told me that nothing you write on paper can be intercepted, altered, or deleted from a server by someone with administrative access. I had thought he was paranoid at the time. I no longer thought that. By the time the station's morning cycle began, and the lights in the corridor shifted from blue to the pale gold that passed for sunrise on an orbital platform, I had 12 pages of handwritten notes. I had the clause, I had the quarterly figures, I had the signing history of the accord, I had the date when humanity's economic classification had been quietly shifted to Class 4, which I now noticed had occurred exactly one treaty cycle before the accord was introduced for signature. That was not a coincidence. I was certain of it the way you are certain the ground is solid before you put your weight on it. Connor Webb came in at the start of the morning cycle and found me still at my desk with a cup of cold tea and 12 pages of handwritten notes. The expression on my face that his own notes later described accurately as very controlled and very careful. He asked if everything was all right. I told him everything was fine and asked him to please bring me the full treaty archive going back 17 years, every quarterly report from the Development Reserve Fund, and a fresh pot of tea. He looked at me for a moment. Connor was 24 years old and had been on the station for 8 months and was smart enough to read a room. He did not ask any more questions. He went to get the archive. I sat alone in the quiet of the administrative wing with my 12 pages of notes. Sitting in the back of my mind, and I thought about the kind of patience it takes to plant something in 47 pages of treaty language and wait for it to grow. I thought about what kind of patience it would take to uproot it. I picked up my pen again. The first page of the archive arrived 20 minutes later. I started reading from the beginning. The archive went back 19 years, not 17. And by the end of the first day I had read all of it. Connor helped. He was quiet and efficient, and he had a gift for finding the right document among stacks of wrong ones. We did not discuss what we were looking for. He sorted. I read. When I found something that mattered, I wrote it down on paper and added it to the growing stack beside my tea. When he brought me a new file, he would glance at the stack, and his expression would shift very slightly, and he would go back to sorting. By midday, the stack was thick enough to press flat under a hand. By late afternoon, I had the shape of it. The clause I had found was not the only one. It was simply the most recent. Going back through the archive, I could see the pattern the way you see a path through a field after the rain has come. Flattened the grass. Suddenly obvious once you knew what direction to look. 17 years ago, a standard renewal of shipping lane rights had included a small amendment reclassifying the administrative status of human-flagged cargo vessels. It was a technical change. Nobody noticed. But that reclassification was referenced 3 years later in a resource assessment framework that had set in the baseline for how human output sectors were evaluated. That framework, in turn, was cited in the trade accord that had shifted humanity's economic classification to Class 4. Each document referred back to the one before it. Each change was small enough to look like housekeeping. Together, they formed a staircase that had been built one step at a time, and humanity had walked down every step without realizing the floor was getting further away. I spread my notes out on the desk and looked at them. 17 years. Whoever had designed this had been patient in a way that was almost difficult to comprehend. They had not rushed. They had not taken anything dramatic or obvious. They had moved carefully, within the rules, in the places nobody was watching, and they had been doing it for nearly 2 decades. The Development Reserve Fund had a public board of directors. I pulled their names and checked them against the council's membership records. 3 of the 7 directors were sitting members of the council's Internal Finance Committee, which was the body that oversaw the quarterly assessment process for the contribution schedule, both deciding how much each species owed and managing the account where the money went. There were no rules against this. I checked the council's entire governance charter, every amendment, every procedural addendum. There was nothing that prohibited a finance committee member from serving on the board of a fund that the finance committee was assessing contributions for. That absence was not an accident either. Connor set a fresh cup of tea on my desk without being asked. I looked up from the governance charter and found him watching me with an expression that was carefully neutral in the way that young, intelligent people make their faces neutral when they are trying not to look frightened. "How bad is it?" he said. I thought about how to answer. "Bring me the population figures for the Kepler, Areli, and New Cartwright sectors," I said, "and the public health allocation data for those same sectors over the last 12 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll get them." The population of those 3 sectors combined was a little over 40 million people. 40 million people living on colony platforms and surface settlements and asteroid belt installations, most of them a long way from Earth, and a longer way from any meaningful political attention. They had come out to the frontier because it offered space and opportunity. Paid off. The health allocation data told a different story. In the same period that the contribution schedule had been draining resource output from their sectors, the per capita health funding for those populations had declined by a measurable amount each year. The decline was not catastrophic. It was not the kind of thing that showed up as a headline. It was the kind of thing that showed up as a doctor who was not replaced when she retired. A medication that was dropped from the approved formulary because it was too expensive. A clinic on an outer platform that reduced its hours, and then reduced them again. Slow pressure. The kind that does not break anything immediately. The kind that wears things down. I sat with that for a while. The station around me was fully awake now. Voices in the corridors. The distant hum of shuttles docking at the outer ring. Through the narrow window, I could see the edge of the planet below us, a curve of pale cloud and darker land. Somewhere down there was the council's main campus, where delegates were attending sessions and filing motions, and having the kind of formal, ceremonial arguments that fill the official record while the real business happens in the documents nobody reads. I picked up my pen. I was not angry. Exactly. What I felt was colder than anger and quieter. It was the feeling of a door opening onto a room you did not know existed. A room that had been there all along. Behind a wall in a house you thought you knew completely. I began writing a summary. Not a complaint. Not an accusation. A summary. A clear, factual document that laid out every step in the chain, with a reference citation for each one, in the order they had occurred, with the dates and the document numbers and the contribution figures and the population health statistics. It took me the rest of the day and most of the night. When I was done, I had 41 pages of handwritten notes and a typed summary document that was 22 pages long. Every claim had a citation. Every figure had a source. There was no emotion in it. There was no language that could be called exaggerated or speculative. It read the way a geological survey reads, dry and exact and utterly certain of what it had found. I read it through once more to make sure. Then I opened a secure channel on my personal communicator. Not the station network, not the delegation's official terminal. And composed a message to my direct supervisor at the Office of Human Diplomatic Affairs on Earth. The message was 3 sentences. The first sentence said that I had found something, and that it was significant. The second sentence said that I was sending her a document under separate, encrypted cover, and that she should read all of it before contacting anyone else. The third sentence said that we should not discuss this on any channel connected to the Council's station network. I sent the message. Then I sent the document through the encrypted relay. Then I sat back and looked at my hands. They were still steady. I was glad of that. It seemed important, right then, that my hands were steady. Connor had fallen asleep on the lounge couch again. I could hear him breathing. I did not wake him. The station's night cycle was quiet, and the lights in the corridor had shifted back to that cold blue, and outside the window the planet turned slowly in the dark. Replacement age. I thought about what came next, and the thought was not frightening. It was the opposite of frightening. It was the feeling of standing at the beginning of a long piece of work and knowing, with complete certainty, that you are the right person to do it, and that you have everything you need, and that you are going to see it through to the very end. I made myself another cup of tea. Then I started writing a second document. This one an analysis of the Council's procedural rules, because what I needed to understand next was not just what they had done, but exactly which of their own rules they would have to break to stop me from undoing it. I do not like the humans. I want to be clear about that from the beginning. My name is Vane, and I have served the Galactic Trade Council as an oversight clerk for 11 years, and in that time I have developed careful, professional opinions about every species represented on this station. The Theresi are arrogant but predictable. The Vorkai are unreliable but honest about it. The Selen Collective are efficient to the point of being unpleasant, which is a trait I can at least respect. The humans I do not know how to categorize, and that is what I do not like about them. They arrived on this station 3 months ago, a small delegation of 7. Their head diplomat was a woman named Maren Voss. She had a thin face and very still brown eyes, and she walked through the council's corridors with the quiet, unhurried movement of someone who knows exactly where she is going, and has already decided how long she is willing to take to get there. I noticed her on the first day because it is my job to notice delegates, particularly delegates who are new. She asked for access to the full treaty archive on her second day. This was unusual. Most delegates worked from summaries and briefings. Nobody reads the full archive. It runs to several million pages across 19 years of documentation, and even the senior clerks only consult it when they have a specific question to answer. And when my office processed the request, I flagged it internally as a curiosity. She and her young aide spent 2 days in the archive. I had the access logs reviewed. They pulled documents from across the entire historical range, not just recent treaties, but agreements going back to the early years of human membership, old shipping reclassifications, framework assessments, economic designation records. I found this interesting in a way that made me uncomfortable. I assigned a junior clerk, a quiet young Vorkai named Sen, to observe the delegation informally. Not to follow them, not to monitor their communications, simply to be present in shared spaces. did not socialize much, and wrote a great deal of things down on paper. Paper. I had not encountered that practice before. My understanding was that it was a very old human habit, largely discontinued. The fact that they had returned to it told me something, though I was not yet certain what. Over the following weeks, the delegation attended every session of the council. Every one. This was also unusual. Delegations attend the sessions that concern their species or their interests. Nobody attends everything. The agenda is too long and too technical, and too full of subjects that have no relevance to most member species. The human delegation attended without exception. Voss sat in the observer gallery with the same expression every day. Attentive, neutral, very slightly interested in the way a person is interested when they are watching something and already know what is going to happen. She took notes. On paper, her young aide attended half the sessions and spent the other half in the archive. I began checking the archive logs more frequently. Sen's reports became less useful because there was less to report. The delegation was doing nothing that could be described as unusual. They attended sessions. They filed the standard procedural acknowledgments that all delegations are required to file. They were courteous to other delegates and said very little beyond pleasantries. The problem was that I did not believe it. I have spent 11 years watching delegates. I know what it looks like when a delegation is simply present, going through the requirements of their posting without engagement or ambition. The human delegation did not look like that. They looked like a group of people who were very carefully doing nothing in a way that required effort. There is a difference. I tried to explain this to my supervisor, a senior clerk named Ovrath, who is Theresi, and therefore inclined toward the view that if something cannot be measured, it does not need attention. Ovrath told me I was constructing a concern out of routine behavior, and that I should redirect my attention to the pending documentation backlog. I redirected my attention to the documentation backlog, and also to the human delegation. The council's quarterly session arrived in the 7th week after Voss's delegation had come on station. A dispute between two freight guilds, a minor amendment to the inspection protocols for Class 3 shipping. The Finance Committee presented its quarterly contribution assessment, as it always did. The numbers were read into the record. The council voted to accept them. It was over in 12 minutes. She sat in the observer gallery with her paper notepad open on her knee. She did not write anything during the Finance Committee's presentation. She did not react to the numbers when they were read. She looked at the committee members the way you look at a thing you are studying, with attention that is too steady and too still to be casual. When the session ended, and the delegates filed out, I was in the corridor near the gallery exit. I saw Voss walk out with her aide. She was saying something to him quietly, and he was writing it down. She glanced up and saw me looking at her. She nodded, pleasantly. The way people nod at familiar faces on a station where you see the same people in the corridors every day. I nodded back. She walked on. Her stride did not change. Her expression did not change. I stood in the corridor for a moment after she had gone. 11 years of this work, and I had developed something close to instinct for the difference between a delegate who is waiting to act and a delegate who is waiting for the right moment to act. They look almost the same from the outside. The difference is in the quality of the patience. A delegate waiting to act is tense in a way that shows in small signs. A certain speed of walking, a particular way of checking communications, a restlessness in the hands. A delegate waiting for the right moment is still. The stillness comes from certainty, from knowing what they are going to do, and having decided they are not going to do it 1 second before the correct time. I went back to my office and pulled her full personnel record from the Interstellar Diplomatic Registry. Born on Earth, 43 years old, 12 years in the diplomatic service. Multiple postings at various council and interspecies forums, commendations for treaty analysis and procedural mediation. No disciplinary notes, no flags. Her previous postings showed a pattern I found significant. She had twice been posted to situations where a treaty or agreement was later found to contain provisions that disadvantaged the parties she represented. In both cases, her documentation and analysis had been cited in the subsequent review process. In both cases, the outcome had been favorable to the disadvantaged party. She found things. That was what she did. She was someone who sat down with a stack of documents and found the things that other people had not found. I sat with that knowledge for a while. Then I went to see Overath again. I told him about her personnel record. I told him about the archive logs. I told him about the pattern of attendance, the note-taking, the stillness. Overath listened to all of it, with the particular patience of a very senior official, who has decided in advance that a junior one is wasting his time. When I finished, he told me that a diplomat reading documents and attending sessions was not a basis for concern. I said that I understood, but that I thought we should be aware she was looking at something specific, and had been for some time. Overath asked me what I thought she was looking for. I told him honestly that I did not know, and that this was the part that concerned me most. He told me to file my observations in the standard monitoring log and return to my duties. I filed my observations. I did not stop watching. The weeks continued. The delegation continued their routine. Voss attended sessions, took notes, spoke rarely. Her aide continued making trips to the archive. Occasionally they had meals in the station's common areas with other human staff from various departments. Maintenance workers. Medical personnel. Engineers. They were talking to the people who lived and worked on the station in practical ways, not the people who attended formal functions. I noted this. I noted the specific people she ate with, and I noted that several of them worked in departments that handled the practical logistics of resource transfer. The teams that processed and recorded the actual movement of goods from member species into the Council's reserve systems. I noted this very carefully. I went back to Ovrath once more. In the 3rd month. He told me, with a degree of patience that suggested he was reaching the end of it, that a diplomat speaking to station staff over meals was ordinary behavior and not a basis for any action of any kind. Would know, from practical day-to-day experience, whether the numbers in the official contribution records matched the numbers they saw moving through the actual logistics systems. I did not tell him that because I did not know what it meant yet, but I felt very clearly the way you feel when you are standing in a building and you become aware for the first time of how quiet it is, the kind of quiet that comes before something. I went back to my desk. I opened the monitoring log. I wrote down everything I had observed, carefully and completely. Then I sat very still, and I waited. Because it seemed to me that whatever Maren Voss had found in that archive, and whatever she was building from it, was going to arrive whether I was ready for it or not. The humans did nothing dramatic. They never did. That, I had come to understand, was exactly the problem. The morning I walked into the council chamber with the motion request in my hand, I had not slept in 31 hours. I was not tired. That surprised me, but it was true. I had been working toward this moment for long enough that the idea of rest felt abstract. something that belonged to a different part of my life. My mind was clear and my hands were steady. And when the door to the council's procedural office opened, and the clerk inside looked up at me, I was able to smile at her in a way that felt genuine. Because it was. And I had eaten lunch with her 3 times in the past 8 weeks, in the station's common areas, and we had talked about her family and my early diplomatic postings, and the particular difficulty of maintaining a healthy sleep cycle on a rotating station. She was kind and thoughtful, and she was very good at her job. She looked at the motion request I set on her desk. She read the title line. Her expression shifted in a way that was extremely small and extremely informative. "Full audit," she said. "Full audit," I confirmed. "Of all council financial records, presented in open session, for the past 17 years. Teal looked at the document for another moment. Then she looked at me. "This will require full council attendance." "Yes. The procedural charter requires it for a motion of this scope. Section 12, subsection 4. I had the charter page number ready. I had every relevant page number ready. The motion is in compliance with all procedural requirements. She read the citations. Everything I had written was correct. I had spent 4 weeks making sure of it. I had not filed the motion until every procedural requirement was met in full, and every reference was verified against the original charter text. There was not a single technical objection that could be raised on procedural grounds. The motion was flawless. Because I had made it flawless. And I had made it flawless because I had known from the beginning that the first thing they would try was a procedural objection. Teal looked up from page 3. She had been a procedural clerk for 9 years, and she knew what a well-constructed motion looked like, and she knew what it meant when someone came to her desk with one. "I'll need to log this for formal submission," she said. "Of course." She began entering the details into her terminal. Her fingers moved steadily. She did not say anything else for a moment. not quite looking at me. This is going to cause a significant reaction. I expect so, I said. She nodded once, in a way that was not agreement or approval or anything I could easily name. Then she finished entering the data and stamped the formal receipt and handed me my copy. The motion was logged. It was in the system. Under council procedural rules, a logged motion of this category had to be formally acknowledged within 48 hours and scheduled for session within 10 days. I thanked Teal, took my receipt, and walked out of the procedural office into the corridor. Connor was waiting outside. He was carrying a shoulder bag that I knew contained 3 printed copies of our complete documentation, the full 22-page summary, the 41 pages of supporting notes, and the annexes, which ran to another 60 pages of cited sources. He had been up as long as I had. He looked calm. He had become, over the past several months, exactly the kind of person you want beside you when you are doing something that cannot be undone. It's logged, I said. Good, he said. We walked back toward the human delegations section of the station. Within 4 hours, I knew the reaction had started. You could feel it in the way the corridors changed. The council's administrative wing was a place where people moved with purpose but without urgency. A professional environment where the pace was measured and controlled. By afternoon, the pace was different. There was more movement. More cluster conversations that stopped when we passed. More deliberate looking away from people who had previously been perfectly comfortable making eye contact. The human delegation's communication terminal received its first informal inquiry call before dinner. It was from a junior aide to one of the finance committee members, asking if there had perhaps been a clerical error in the motion filing. I responded in writing, politely, that there had been no error, and that the motion had been reviewed against the full procedural charter before filing. The second call came from a senior aide to the council's general secretary, asking whether the human delegation would be willing to discuss the motion in a preliminary conference before the formal session. I responded in writing that we would be happy to attend any formally scheduled conference that was entered into the official record. The third call did not come through the official system. It came through a personal line to my individual communicator, from a number I recognized as belonging to a senior finance committee member named Councillor Drath. I had looked up all 7 finance committee members by name and photographed 6 weeks ago. Drath's message suggested that many of humanity's concerns about economic classifications might be addressable through a quiet bilateral review process, outside of formal session, that could produce mutually beneficial adjustments without the difficulties that a full public audit might create. I read the message twice. Then I wrote back, politely, that the human delegation's position was that all matters related to the motion would be addressed through official council procedures, and that we looked forward to the scheduled session. I did not mention that I had logged Drath's personal contact to our documentation file, with timestamp and content, as evidence of communication made after the filing of the motion. Not threatening communication, not inappropriate by any definition I could have cited at the time, but logged. Because logging things was what I did. Connor came into my office with 2 cups of tea, and set one on my desk and sat down across from me. "How many calls?" he said. "3 today. There will be more tomorrow." He nodded. He wrapped both hands around his cup. "Are you sure they won't find a procedural way to block it?" "They will try," I said. "They have 2 avenues. They can challenge the motion on procedural grounds, which requires them to identify a specific rule violation. which requires a two-thirds majority of full council members. Connor thought about that. Do they have two-thirds? 3 months ago, probably yes. I looked at my tea. I have been speaking with the delegations from the Kepler-adjacent systems, the Cellin Collective, the frontier freight guilds that have been assessed under similar contribution schedules. I have been speaking with them quietly, at meals, in hallways, in the small conversations that do not go into any official record. I had been doing that carefully, not lobbying. I had been clear with myself about the line. I had shared no confidential information. I had asked no one to take any position. I had simply, over many weeks, spoken with people about their own experiences with the contribution system. And I had listened. And sometimes I had asked a question, and sometimes I had not. People remember who listened to them. So two-thirds is less certain, Connor said. Two-thirds is considerably less certain, I said. The formal acknowledgement of the motion arrived the next morning. As required. The session was scheduled for 8 days' time. The agenda listing described it as a procedural financial review motion, which was technically accurate and beautifully understated. The longest of my life. The council's corridors continued their shifted pace. Meetings happened behind closed doors that I had previously seen standing open. Communication traffic through the delegation networks increased noticeably according to the station's public load indicators. Not the content, which I had no access to, but the volume, which told its own story. Councillor Drath sent 2 more messages through personal channels. Both were variations on the bilateral review idea, offered with increasing warmth and flexibility. I responded to both in the same way, politely and in writing, directing the conversation to official procedures. A Theresi council member I had not spoken with before introduced himself in the common area one morning and engaged me in a pleasant conversation about human cultural history. He was charming and well-read and showed no sign of having any agenda. I was courteous and equally pleasant, and filed a note about the conversation when I returned to my office. On the 5th day, a formal procedural objection was filed against the motion by 3 council members, citing an interpretation of the Charter's financial privacy provisions. I had prepared a 40-page response to it. I filed the response within 2 hours of receiving the objection. The procedural subcommittee reviewed it the next morning and ruled, in a 3-2 decision, that the objection did not apply. On the 7th day, Connor came into my office with a look on his face that I had not seen from him before. He said, "There's going to be a preliminary vote tomorrow, on postponement." I set down my pen. "Who called it?" He named 2 senior council members. I recognized them both as close associates of the Finance Committee leadership. They can push the session back, reset the timeline, use the delay to build more opposition. Yes, I said. Do we have the votes to block it? I had spent the past week paying very careful attention to exactly this question, without ever asking it directly of anyone. I believe so, I said, but I won't know until the count. Connor looked at me. He was quiet for a moment. What if we don't? He said. I thought about 40 million people and declining health allocations, and a variable contribution schedule, with no ceiling, and no oversight, and 17 years of patience on one side of a ledger. Then we try again, I said. We have the citations. We have the record. The record does not go away. He nodded once. Then he picked up his tea and went back to his desk. The postponement vote happened the next morning. They did not have the votes. The session was confirmed. I sat at my desk for a moment after the result came through on the terminal. Outside my window, the planet below was in its daylight face, bright and still and enormous. The station's outer ring was running its full activity cycle. Full light, full hum, the ordinary sounds of thousands of beings going about their work. I picked up the 74 pages of completed documentation from the corner of my desk. The summary, the supporting notes, the annexes, the evidence of Counselor Drath's personal communications, all of it. And I held the stack in my hands for a moment. 17 years. Someone had been patient for 17 years. I thought I could manage one more day. The session began at the 3rd hour of the station's morning cycle, and by the time every seat in the council chamber was filled, you could feel the weight of the room, the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather arrives. I sat at the human delegations table with Connor on my left, and the full documentation in 2 neat stacks in front of us. The chamber was large and circular, with the council members arranged in a tiered ring above the floor where the delegations sat. Every tier was occupied. I had not seen full attendance at a council session since my first week on the station, when I had attended a ceremonial address as an orientation exercise. That had been a formal occasion. This was not a ceremony. The General Secretary called the session to order. He was a tall Theresi named Councillor Auvert, who I had found to have no direct financial relationship with the Development Reserve Fund. He read the motion into the record. His voice was steady. His face was the face of a person who has decided to perform his function regardless of what it costs. I stood up. The chamber was quiet in a way that rooms only get quiet when everyone in them stops moving at the same time. I did not look at the Finance Committee members. I had looked at them enough. I knew their faces. I knew their document signatures. I knew the quarterly vote records in which they had approved the contribution assessments and then voted on how to allocate the resulting funds. I looked at the General Secretary, and I spoke clearly, and I started at the beginning. I started 17 years ago, with a shipping reclassification that had taken 3 minutes to approve and 17 years to trace. I walked through each document in sequence, and for each one I stated the date, the document number, the relevant provision, and its relationship to the document that followed it. I did not editorialize. I did not use language like fraud or scheme or harm. I used the language of the documents themselves, which was careful and technical and, when read in sequence and out loud in a council chamber with every member in attendance, said everything that needed to be said without any help from me. I spoke for 40 minutes. When I finished, I sat down. The chamber held its quiet for 3 seconds. I counted. Then the General Secretary asked if the Finance Committee wished to respond. Councillor Drath stood up. He was a composed individual, well practiced at the formal setting of a council session, and he began to speak about the complexity of interstellar economic frameworks, and the legitimate purpose of development reserve systems, and the various beneficial projects funded by the reserve over the years. I let him speak. When he was finished, I requested the floor again. I was granted it. I set the first annex on the table in front of me and read from it. The annex listed every project funded by the Development Reserve in the past 10 years, with the cost of each one and the recipient. Then I read from the second annex, which listed the species that had contributed to the reserve over the same period, the amounts contributed, and the breakdown by quarter. Then I read from the third, which was the public health allocation data for the 3 human frontier sectors. I did not connect these things out loud. I read them in sequence, one after another, and I let the numbers do the work that numbers do when they are placed next to each other in a room full of people who can add. A Cellin collective delegate requested the floor. I referred them to Section 4 of my summary document, which was being distributed by Connor to all delegations in the chamber. The Cellin delegate read Section 4 and asked a follow-up question about the composition of the assessment committee. I referred them to Section 7. A delegate from one of the frontier freight guilds asked about the absence of an appeal mechanism in the contribution schedule. I referred them to Section 9, which included the original charter language and the specific amendment history showing when the appeal mechanism that had existed in an earlier version had been removed. It had been removed in a routine administrative update 11 years ago. The update had been approved in a session with 40% attendance. Nobody had asked questions. It had taken 4 minutes. The Finance Committee attempted 3 times to raise procedural points. The General Secretary ruled twice that the procedural points were not applicable. The third time he called a brief recess. During the recess, Connor poured water into 2 glasses without being asked, and I drank mine, and the chamber around us was full of the sound of delegations talking quietly to each other, and the rustle of documentation being read. "They're reading it," Connor said. "Yes," I said. "The Cellin block is definitely reading it," he said. "2 of the Frontier Guild delegates have been on page 11 for the last 10 minutes. I nodded. Page 11 was where the full contribution figures were laid out, year by year, with the corresponding colony sector health allocation trends in a parallel column. The session resumed. The General Secretary directed the Finance Committee to respond formally to the documentation provided. Drath stood again. He spoke for 20 minutes. He addressed some of the specific points and did not address others. He used phrases like historically consistent practice, and mutual benefit framework, and transparent process. I wrote nothing down. I already had everything I needed. When Drath sat down, 2 other Finance Committee members spoke briefly. Their tone had changed from what it had been in the first part of the session. The first had sounded controlled and confident. Now they sounded like people who are performing confidence because the alternative is visibly worse. The General Secretary called for formal responses from other council members. 7 delegations requested the floor. 6 of them asked questions that could not be answered without producing additional documentation that the Finance Committee did not want to produce in open session. The 7th. A representative from a species I had spoken with briefly over a meal 3 weeks earlier, who had told me that their own resource sectors had been quietly reclassified 2 years ago, made a formal statement supporting the audit motion, requesting that the scope be expanded to include all member species contribution assessments going back 20 years. The chamber shifted. I could feel it. The Finance Committee member to Drath's left leaned over and spoke quietly to him. Drath listened with the expression of a person who is hearing something they had hoped not to hear. The vote on whether to proceed with the full audit was called at the 6th hour of the session. It passed. Not narrowly. Not by a coalition scraped together at the last moment. By a margin that made the result obvious from the first count. Connor exhaled quietly next to me. It was the only sound he made. I gathered my documentation into a neat stack and aligned the edges. The audit would take time. It would find things we had not found yet. Because 17 years of documentation in a system this large held more than any two people with a paper archive and a personal communicator could uncover. There would be further sessions. There would be committee hearings and formal reviews, and the kind of slow, grinding procedural work that is neither dramatic nor easy, but is the only way to actually change something. The finance committee members were filing out of the chamber. Drath passed within a few meters of our table. He did not look at me. I did not watch him go. I was looking at the general secretary, who was making a notation in the official session record, writing down what had just happened in the formal language of council proceedings, making it permanent. Connor started packing the documentation into its folders. "What now?" he said. We submit our documentation as the primary evidentiary record. We make ourselves available to answer questions. We make sure the audit terms include independent oversight. Genuine sound that was the first laugh I had heard from either of us in several days. We walked out of the council chamber into the corridor. The station was in its full activity cycle, bright and busy, people moving in all directions. I passed a window and saw the planet below, the same planet I had been looking at from my office for months, enormous and calm and indifferent to what happened on the small orbital platform, circling above it. The resource contribution schedule. About the person who had written it, who had been patient enough to plant it and wait, and who had perhaps believed that patience of that kind, spread over that much time and that many documents, was invisible. It almost was. I went back to the human delegations section and sat at my desk and wrote a message to my supervisor on Earth. It was longer than the first message I had sent her. The one 3 months ago with 3 sentences. This one ran to several paragraphs. It told her what had happened, in the same clear, factual way I had told everything. Then I told her something else. I told her that the audit would be long, and that its findings would likely require structural changes to the Council's governance framework, and that some of those changes would be resisted, and that the process would require someone on the station to maintain the pressure and the documentation and the attention that had brought it this far. I told her I intended to be that person. I told her to book my station posting for another 2 years, at minimum. Then I sent the message, and I sat back, and I looked at the ceiling for a long time without thinking about anything in particular. The work was not done. It was nowhere close to done. What had happened in the chamber today was a beginning, not an end. The first formal step in a process that would be long and complicated, and would require exactly the kind of steady, unhurried attention that I had always been better at than anything else. I was not in a hurry. I had learned something in the past months that I had perhaps always known but had never needed as directly as I needed it now. Patience is not passive. It is not waiting and hoping and looking away. Real patience is active. It is the daily decision to keep working, to keep documenting, to stay in the room, to trust that the accumulation of small, careful, undeniable things will eventually become something that cannot be ignored. Whoever had built the contribution system had been patient in that way. They had believed their patience was a weapon. They had been right. They had simply not considered that the same patience worked in the other direction. I picked up my pen. There were more documents to read.